Thank you for joining us at Living Word Press for our 12 Days of Christmas. And today's reflection begins with an important Christmas verse, Matthew chapter 1, verse 23. The verse says, "The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son." And I want us to notice the name of this son. They will call his name Immanuel, because that name means God with us. The promise of Immanuel, God with us, is at the heart of Christmas. Throughout the Bible, God demonstrates his holy and powerful presence in a variety of ways: in a burning bush to Moses, in a quaking mountain at Sinai, and in the brilliant light of the Shekinah glory. But God has also revealed that he is with us in a baby and in the person of Jesus. God encounters us in the person of Jesus because he desires to have a real and a personal relationship with each and every one of us. God's presence with humanity and that deep desire for relationship is what the Bible is all about. One writer says this: "The incarnation brings to a climax the relational presence of God, the theme that drove the entire Old Testament story." So the entire Old Testament, really the Bible as a whole, is about God's relational presence and desire for relationship. The Bible begins with a garden in Genesis and concludes with an eternal city in Revelation. But the thing that brings those stories together is that the tree of life and the presence of God is in both. God's presence is the source of real and everlasting life. At the beginning of the story, Adam and Eve walk with God in the garden, and when they are banished from the garden because of their sin, they not only lose their home and the place that they live, they lose that special sacred space, that place where they have enjoyed fellowship and relationship with God. And the question that arises when we read the story is, will sinful humans ever again be able to experience that presence and relationship with God that Adam and Eve enjoyed in the way that they enjoyed it? We begin to get the answer to that question in Genesis chapter 5, which tells us that a man named Enoch, Genesis 5:22-24, walks with God and then is even transported to heaven before he dies. In the rest of Genesis, Noah and Abraham walk before God. The patriarchs experience God's presence at altars and sacred places, and God is with Joseph when he is taken away to Egypt. The people of Israel had a more permanent way of experiencing God's presence when they came into the Promised Land. Exodus chapter 15, verse 17 says that the Promised Land was a sanctuary, and the entire land was a place that the Lord had prepared for his dwelling among the people. The Promised Land itself is sacred space. The tabernacle that Israel constructed according to God's instruction and design is a portable Garden of Eden in a fallen world, and the Lord announces in Leviticus 26:12, "I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people." That was the purpose of God providing this tabernacle. When the tabernacle is completed, the glory of God comes down to dwell in the sacred tent as God's royal residence. And the same thing happens when Solomon builds and then dedicates the temple. God is pictured as the great king who sits enthroned in the Holy of Holies. God has a street address on One Zion Avenue because God is dwelling and living among his people. The greatest blessing that Israel had was enjoying God as their next door neighbor. And having God near them in that way meant that God was always there to meet them, to receive their worship, to forgive them and to restore them when they had sinned, to help them when they needed him, to protect them from their enemies, and to answer their prayers when they cried to him. We know that eventually the glory of God leaves the temple in Ezekiel 8-11 because the people's sin and disobedience had brought that about. But Jesus in the incarnation brings the presence of God to earth in a more perfect and permanent way. The presence and glory of God in a person is far better and far more personal than it could have ever been in a building or a structure. John 1:14 even says that the Word, Jesus, became flesh and dwelled or tabernacled. That's the actual word. Tabernacled among us. And we beheld his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father. The purpose of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus was to make it possible for God's presence to be with us now and forever. Through his sacrifice on the cross, Jesus has opened the way into the presence of God for sinners like us. We don't go to the temple anymore, or to Jerusalem, or to any sacred place or building, because Hebrews 12:22 says that we have something better. We have come in this lifetime to the heavenly Zion, into the city of the living God, because the presence of God is always with us wherever we might go. The church, as the people of God, is the spiritual temple because God is living and dwelling in us, both individually and collectively. Paul says in Colossians that Christ in us is our hope of glory. And when we reach the end of the biblical story, we see the return of the Garden of Eden in the new heavens, the new earth, and the new Jerusalem. In Revelation 21 and 22, the tree of life is there, but most of all, heaven comes down to earth, and there will not even be a temple in the city or the need for one, because God will come down and will live and dwell with his people forever. Jesus was God with us in the incarnation so that we could be with him forever. God with us means that he will never leave us or forsake us. God with us means that nothing can separate us from God's love in Christ Jesus. God with us means that he is there for us when we're discouraged or hurting, lonely, or even when others have let us down. God with us means that he is always present when we need his grace, his strength, his wisdom, his forgiveness, or comfort for whatever we might be going through in life now, or anything that we will ever face throughout the course of our lifetime. God with us is what Christmas is all about. That's the name Immanuel, God with us, and that's the meaning and significance of that special name. Thank you for allowing us to share this piece of the Christmas story with you. Merry Christmas and God bless.